Flora Nuzom pressed her mother's wedding ring into Tucker Blackburn's palm and said, "Take it back. I won't pretend this is anything but what it is, a transaction." Tucker didn't flinch. He closed his fingers around the ring, set it on the table between them, and said quietly, "Then we agree. No pretending." She hadn't expected that. She'd expected anger, maybe cruelty, the kind of man his reputation promised. Instead, he walked out and left her standing alone in a stranger's house wearing a dead woman's dress, with nothing but fear to keep her company. If this story already has you holding your breath, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. We want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Flora Nuzom was sold. The sky over Copper Creek was the color of an old bruise. She didn't use the word sold. Her father didn't either. Edmund Nuzom called it an arrangement. He said it over breakfast with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold, the same way he said everything these days, quietly, without looking at her, as though the words might hurt less if they were delivered to the tabletop rather than to his daughter's face. "Tucker Blackburn has agreed to assume the debt," Edmund said. "All of it. The banknote, the feed bill, Hargrove's loan, every cent." Flora set down her fork. "In exchange for what, Papa?" He didn't answer immediately. That silence told her everything. "For me," she said. Not a question. Edmund Nuzom finally looked up. His eyes were red at the rims, the way they got when he hadn't slept, and she could see the shame moving across his face, like a weather system, slow, inevitable, impossible to stop. "You'd have a good life, Flora. The Blackburn Ranch is—" "Don't." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Don't tell me about the ranch. Don't tell me what I'd have. Tell me what you're giving away." He put the cup down. "I'm giving you a future. You're giving me to a man I've never spoken to." She pushed back from the table. "A man who's 40 years old and mean as a cornered bull, if half the county is to be believed." "He's 35, Edmund said, as if the correction mattered. Flora walked to the window. Outside, the land stretched brown and cracked under a sky that hadn't delivered rain in 14 months. She could see the ribs of it. The drought had stripped Copper Creek down to its bones. 3 neighboring ranches had folded entirely. The Harmons had packed their wagon and gone west. Old Silas Pratt had simply walked off his property one morning and never come back. Her father's ranch, what remained of it, was held together by prayer and the grace of creditors who were rapidly losing patience. She understood the math. She had always been good at math. The debt was $840. It might as well have been $8,000. Edmund Nuzom didn't have 840 cents. "When?" she asked. "Saturday." That was 3 days away. She turned from the window. Her father was looking at his coffee cup again. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to knock the cup from his hands and demand that he look at her, really look at her, and acknowledge what he was doing. But she also saw the way his shoulders curved inward, the way the drought had taken 10 years off his future and put 15 onto his face, and she understood that shame was already eating him alive. Adding to it wouldn't change a single thing. "All right," she said. Edmund looked up sharply. "Flora." "I said all right, Papa." She walked past him toward the stairs. "I'll need my mother's dress let out at the waist. I've filled out since she wore it last." She met Tucker Blackburn for the first time on Friday afternoon, the day before the ceremony. He rode onto the Nuzom property with 2 ranch hands trailing behind him, which Flora thought was the sort of entrance a man made when he wanted to be noticed. She watched from the porch as he dismounted, and her first thought was that he was bigger than she'd imagined. Not soft big, not the comfortable roundness of a prosperous man, but solid like something hammered into shape. He moved with the economy of a person who had never wasted a gesture in his life. He took off his hat when he reached the porch steps. That surprised her. "Miss Nuzom," he said. "Mr. Blackburn?" He had gray eyes. She hadn't expected that either. She'd imagined something harder, something that matched the stories. People in Copper Creek talked about Tucker Blackburn the way they talked about a drought or a flash flood. He'd come into this valley 12 years ago with nothing but a horse and a contract, and by some combination of relentless work and what people called ruthlessness, he'd built 20,000 acres of productive cattle land. Men who'd crossed him in business didn't cross him twice. 2 cattle drives had nearly broken other operations, and Blackburn had absorbed their losses and kept moving. But his eyes looking at her now were not the eyes of a flood. They were watchful, careful. "Your father tells me you're agreeable to this arrangement," he said. "My father tells you a great deal," Flora replied. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a recognition of some kind, like a card player noting an unexpected hand. "I appreciate straight talk, Miss Newsom. So let me give you some. I'm not looking for a woman who's afraid of me. I've got enough people on my payroll walking on eggshells. What I need is someone capable of running a household the size of a small town who won't fall apart when the work gets hard." "You're describing a housekeeper," Flora said, "not a wife. I'm describing what the job requires. The rest of it—" He paused, and she couldn't read what lived behind the pause. "We'll figure the rest of it out as we go." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't tender. It was the most honest thing any man had said to her in 3 days. And she held on to that honesty the way you hold on to a fence post in a windstorm, not because it's comfortable, but because it's the only solid thing available. "I'll see you tomorrow then," she said. He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am." He rode off without looking back. Flora stood on the porch and watched the dust, his horse raised, settle back into the cracked earth, and she thought, "I don't know this man at all. And tomorrow, I'll be his wife." The ceremony was held in the Copper Creek Methodist Church, which smelled of old hymn books and beeswax candles. There were 12 people present. Her father, her Aunt Margaret from Pueblo, who had arrived the evening before and spent the night alternating between weeping and offering practical advice about managing large households. Reverend Calhoun, who was 63 years old and had married more reluctant couples than he probably cared to count. Tucker's ranch foreman, a lean, weathered man named Cal Briggs, who stood with his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. A handful of townspeople who had come out of curiosity or sympathy, Flora couldn't tell which. She wore her mother's dress. It was ivory silk with a high collar, 12 years out of fashion, and it fit her well enough after Margaret's determined work with a needle and thread. She carried a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that her father had picked before dawn. She didn't know when she'd started crying, but by the time she reached the altar, her face was wet. Tucker was already standing at the front of the church. He'd cleaned up fresh shirt, dark coat hair combed back from his face, and the formality of it made him look slightly less like himself, like a man wearing a costume. He turned when she came down the aisle, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something complicated move through his expression. Not pity. Something closer to gravity. Like a man who understood the weight of what was happening here. Reverend Calhoun opened his Bible and began. Flora heard the words in fragments. Holy matrimony. Sacred institution. Love and honor. She kept her eyes on the Reverend's collar because she couldn't look at Tucker and she couldn't look at her father. And looking at the back of the church meant looking at the door, which meant thinking about running. Which meant thinking about the $840 that would vanish if she did. Do you, Flora Margaret Newsom, take this man? Do you? As if there were a choice being made here. As if this were something that required her genuine consent rather than her resigned compliance. She said, I do, in a voice she didn't recognize. Tucker's voice was low and even when he repeated the same words. Like a man reading a contract aloud. She supposed that's what it was. Reverend Calhoun said they were husband and wife. Tucker took her hand briefly, firmly, and that was all. No kiss. She was grateful for that. A kiss would have felt like a lie, and she had enough of those already sitting in her chest. Her father held her in the churchyard afterward, and that was when Flora finally broke. Not loudly. Edmund Newsom had never been the kind of man who made public displays of emotion, and he'd raised her the same way. but she pressed her face into his shoulder and shook for a long moment, and he held her with both arms, and she felt the wetness of his face against her hair. "You're a good girl, Flora," he said. "You always have been." She pulled back and looked at him. The shame was still there in his face, but something else too: relief. That was the hardest part. She could see the relief, and she understood it, and she didn't forgive it, and she didn't condemn it, and she didn't know what to do with any of it. "Take care of yourself, Papa," she said. She picked up her bag. One trunk had already been loaded onto Tucker's wagon, and she walked across the churchyard to where Tucker Blackburn stood waiting with the patience of a man who had learned that the world moved at its own pace, regardless of his preference. He took her bag without asking and stowed it in the wagon. They drove out of Copper Creek without speaking. The silence between them on that wagon seat was not the comfortable silence of people who knew each other well. It was the silence of two strangers who had been dropped into close proximity and were both pretending not to feel the edges of it. Flora watched the country roll past. She knew this land she'd grown up on its margins, had ridden its draws and gullies since she was old enough to sit a horse. But she'd never been this far north of town, up into the higher range, where the Blackburn operation spread itself across the good grass. The land looked different up here. More itself somehow. Less beaten. Tucker spoke first after they'd been on the road for close to an hour. "Mrs. Winters will show you around the house," he said. "She runs the domestic side. Been with me 8 years. She's capable and she's fair, and she'll give you whatever you need." "Thank you," Flora said. "You can tell me if there's something you want changed. In the house, your room, the arrangements, any of it." She turned to look at him. "My room." "You'll have your own," he said simply, eyes on the road. "Whatever else this is, I'm not an animal." Something loosened fractionally in Flora's chest. She hadn't let herself think about that part, had pushed it firmly into a closed room in her mind, because the alternative was a kind of panic she couldn't afford. The fact that he'd said it plainly without ceremony, without expecting gratitude, made it easier to breathe. "All right," she said. "I'll need you present for meals and for whatever the house requires during the day. Beyond that, your time is your own until you find your footing." "You talk about this like it's an employment situation," Flora said. "In some respects it is. And in the other respects—" He was quiet for a moment. The road bent north, and the Blackburn Range opened up ahead of them, wide and rolling green in the places where the wells had held amber everywhere else. "I haven't figured that out yet," Tucker said. "I'll let you know when I do." It wasn't the answer she wanted. She didn't know what answer she wanted, but it was honest, and she kept returning to that quality in him, the refusal to dress things up in language they didn't deserve, the way a tongue keeps returning to a sore tooth. The ranch house was not what Flora had expected. She had imagined something grim and bachelor sparse, a place that had never known a woman's hand and showed it in every unswept corner. Instead, she found a house that was large and plainly organized, with good furniture and clean windows, and a kitchen that smelled of bread someone had baked that morning. It was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It was a house that had been maintained with discipline rather than affection, which she supposed matched its owner. Mrs. Winters met them at the door. She was a small, broad-shouldered woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked structural, and eyes the color of good creek water, clear and watchful, and not unkind. She looked at Flora the way a person looks at something that might be fragile and might not be, and is reserving judgment. "Mrs. Blackburn," she said. The name sat strangely in the air. "Flora," Flora said. "Please." Something in Mrs. Winters' expression relaxed by a degree. "Come in then, Flora. I'll show you your room, and we'll get you sorted out." Tucker took her trunk inside and set it at the foot of the stairs. He stood for a moment in the entryway, hat in hand, and looked at Flora with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I'll be in the north pasture until supper," he said. "If you need anything before then, Cal Briggs is in the yard." And then he was gone out the door and back into the wide country that was his natural element. And Flora was left standing in her new house, in her mother's dress, with her heart pounding in her ears. Mrs. Winters put a hand briefly on her arm. "Come on, then," she said quietly. "The first day is always the worst." Her room was at the end of the upstairs hall, away from Tucker's. It had a window that faced east toward the mountains, and someone she suspected Mrs. Winters had put a small blue pitcher of wildflowers on the dresser. It was such a small gesture that it nearly undid her. She sat on the edge of the bed in her mother's dress and pressed her hands together in her lap and told herself very firmly not to cry again. She had cried enough. Crying was a luxury that cost energy she was going to need. Think about what's real, she told herself. Think about what you can touch. She was here. The room was clean. She had privacy. The man she had married had not raised his voice at her once, had not looked at her the way she'd feared, had not made a single claim that he hadn't warned her about in advance. It wasn't a marriage. It was a negotiation with an open conclusion. But she was alive and intact, and there were wildflowers on the dresser, and for tonight, that would have to be enough.
Chapter 7.
Supper was the first real test. Mrs. Winters served it in the dining room, a table long enough for 12 people with Tucker at the head, and Flora placed at the nearest seat to him, which still left 3 feet of polished wood between them. Cal Briggs joined them, along with 2 other senior ranch hands, whose names Flora learned were Pete Duvall and a young man everyone called Wick, for reasons nobody explained. They looked at her the way men look at something unexpected, assessing guarded, not unfriendly, but not warm. She recognized the calculation in their eyes. Who is she? Will she last? What does she want? She had grown up around ranch hands. She knew how to manage that calculation. "Pete," she said when he passed the bread without offering it to her. "Do you take a full loaf at every meal, or is there some available for the rest of the table?" Pete Duvall blinked. Then slowly the corner of his mouth moved. He handed her the bread with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Yes, ma'am. Beg pardon." Tucker was watching her from the head of the table. She couldn't read his expression, but she kept her eyes on her plate and ate her supper and answered questions when they were asked, and asked a few of her own. And by the time Mrs. Winters brought out the coffee, the tension at the table had shifted from wariness to something more like cautious interest. After supper, Tucker followed her into the hallway. "You did well," he said. "I wasn't doing anything for your benefit," Flora told him. "I know that," he said. "That's why I said it." She looked at him. He was standing in the hallway light, and without his hat, he looked less imposing. Just a large, tired man who had spent the day in the saddle and come home to a dinner table that was more complicated than it used to be. "What do you want from this?" she asked. It came out before she could stop it. "Actually want. Not what you told my father, not what made sense on paper. What do you actually want from this arrangement?" Tucker was quiet for a long moment. "I want the ranch to outlast me," he said finally. "I want to know that when I'm gone, what I built doesn't just scatter to the wind, that it means something to somebody." He paused. "And I've been alone long enough that I've started to notice it. That's all." It was more than she'd expected, more honest than anything a man in his position had any obligation to offer. "That's a reasonable thing to want," Flora said. "What do you want?" he asked. She considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I want to not be afraid," she said. "I'm not there yet, but I want to get there." Tucker Blackburn looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way a man nods when he's made a decision or accepted a fact he can't change. "That's reasonable too," he said. He went upstairs. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house settle around her. The creak of old boards, the wind coming off the range, the distant sound of cattle, and thought that she had survived the first day. One day was not a marriage, but it was a beginning. And somewhere underneath the fear, underneath the grief and the strangeness and the weight of her mother's silk against her skin, there was something she couldn't quite name yet. Not hope exactly, but the shape that hope sometimes leaves behind when it's been in a room. She was almost asleep when she heard the knock at her door. Flora sat up, pulse spiking hard. The knock came again 3 times measured. "Yes." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Tucker's voice through the door. "I need to tell you something. It won't wait until morning." She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and crossed to the door. She opened it 6 inches. He was still dressed. He hadn't been to bed. He was holding an envelope plain white creased like it had been read more than once, and his expression had changed from the careful neutrality of supper to something that sat much closer to the bone. "What is it?" Flora asked. "Your father's debt," Tucker said. "All of it is settled. The banknote is cleared, the feed bill is paid, and Hargrove has been bought out in full." "I know," Flora said. "That was the arrangement. What your father doesn't know," Tucker said, "and what I should have told you before today, is that there's more debt than what he told you about." Flora went very still. "How much more?" she asked. Tucker held out the envelope. "Enough that if I hadn't stepped in last week, the county would have seized the property by the 1st of next month, and your father would have had nothing left. Not the house, not the land, not the equipment." He paused. "Not even the clothes on his back." Flora took the envelope. She opened it slowly, though some part of her already understood what she was going to find. Her father hadn't told her the full number. He hadn't told her how bad it truly was, because if he had, she might have argued differently, or might not have argued at all, might simply have collapsed under the weight of it. The total was not $840. It was $2,312. Flora stood in her doorway holding the paper, and the cold that moved through her was not from the night air. "He didn't tell me," she said. "No," Tucker said. "He didn't." "Why are you telling me now?" Tucker looked at her steadily. "Because you asked me what I actually wanted from this arrangement. And what I want is for there to be no lies between us. Not from him, not from me, not from you." He waited a beat. "You deserve to walk into this knowing the full truth. I should have made sure you knew it before the ceremony. That's my failing, and I'm sorry for it." Flora looked at the paper. She looked at the number. She thought about her father at the breakfast table with his cold coffee and his downcast eyes, and his word arrangement like a cloth thrown over something ugly to hide its shape. She had thought she was saving the ranch. She had thought she understood the bargain. She had been saving her family from ruin she hadn't even been allowed to see the edges of. The anger was there, large and cold and entirely justified. At her father, at the situation, even fractionally at this man standing in her doorway who had known and waited. But underneath the anger, something else was clarifying. Something that had been soft and formless since that wagon ride across the range was starting to take a definite shape. Tucker Blackburn had come to her room at this hour, on her first night in his house, not to take anything, to give her the truth. Flora folded the envelope and held it at her side. "Good night, Mr. Blackburn," she said. He put his hat on. "Good night, Mrs. Blackburn." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a long moment in the dark, and she did not cry, and she did not sleep, and she held the paper in her hands until it was warm from her skin, and she thought about what it meant that the man she feared most in the world had just done the most honest thing anyone had done for her in years. She didn't know what to call that yet, but she knew she would not forget it. She didn't sleep until well past midnight, and when she did, she dreamed of her father's hands, the way they'd looked wrapped around that cold coffee cup, hiding something behind the ordinary weight of ceramic and silence. She woke before dawn with the envelope still on the nightstand beside her, and she lay there, in the gray half-light, and made herself a promise. Whatever this marriage was, whatever it would become, she would not be caught uninformed again. She would learn the shape of everything around her before it had the chance to surprise her. That was how Flora Newsom had always survived, not by softness, by paying attention. She dressed without help the way she always had, and came downstairs to find Mrs. Winters already in the kitchen with flour on her forearms and coffee on the stove. The older woman looked at her just one sharp glance and poured a second cup without being asked. "You're up early," Mrs. Winters said. "I'm always up early," Flora said. Mrs. Winters set the cup in front of her. "Tucker's been gone since 4. He does that when something's working at him." Flora wrapped her hands around the cup. "Does he do it often? Often enough that I don't remark on it anymore." Mrs. Winters went back to her dough. But I'll remark on it today since you're asking, because I think you ought to know the kind of man you've married." Flora looked up. Mrs. Winters kept her eyes on the dough. "He doesn't sleep when he's troubled. He works instead. Always has. Some men drink, some men fight. Tucker Blackburn goes out in the dark and fixes fence posts." A pause. "He was out there at 4 this morning. I heard him." "Why are you telling me this?" Flora asked. Mrs. Winters looked at her then, and the expression on her face was not soft exactly, but it was direct and without agenda, and Flora had spent enough time around women to know the difference. "Because you're going to make up your mind about him in the next 2 weeks. Everybody does. And most people make up their minds wrong, because they're looking at the surface." She turned back to the dough. "I've worked for that man 8 years. I've seen him sit with a dying calf through an entire night so it wouldn't be alone when it went. I've seen him cut his own salary for 3 months to keep 4 ranch hands employed through a bad season. I've seen him turn down offers that would have made him twice as rich if it meant breaking promises he'd made to smaller operations." She pressed hard into the dough. "He is not an easy man, but easy men don't build what he's built, and they don't do it the way he's done it." Flora was quiet for a moment. "Why did he never remarry?" she asked. "Before now. He's 35. He had to have had options." Mrs. Winters smiled small private like the question amused her. "He had options. He turned them all down. Said he wasn't going to bring a woman into this life until he was sure the life itself was worth bringing her into." She paused. "Make of that what you will." Flora made of it quite a lot. She sat with her coffee and her thoughts, while the kitchen filled with the smell of bread baking, and she felt the simple disorienting reality of being in an unfamiliar place that was doing its best to feel like it could eventually be home. She explored the house that first full morning the way she would have explored any new territory methodically, without rushing touching things only when she needed to understand them. The house was larger than it looked from the outside. A front parlor that was formal and barely used, she could tell by the air in it the way it held its breath. A library which surprised her with actual books arranged on actual shelves, not for show, but for use. The spines were cracked, the pages marked. She pulled one out at random, a manual on cattle breeding dense with margin notes in a hand that was large and somewhat impatient-looking. Tucker's, obviously. She put it back, but she remembered it. Off the main hall was an office closed door, which she did not open. A dining room she already knew. A mud room at the back with 6 pairs of boots in descending sizes which confused her until she realized the 3 smallest pairs were very old and had belonged to a child. She stopped at that. She stood in the mud room, looking at those 3 small pairs of boots worn through at the toe, on the right foot of each, which meant the child had dragged that foot when they walked, and she felt the sudden awareness of a story she didn't know. A child who had lived here. A child who was gone. She filed that information the same way she'd filed the margin notes and the fence posts in the dark carefully, without conclusion available for later. Mrs. Winters found her there. "Whose were those?" Flora asked, before she could decide whether to ask. Mrs. Winters looked at the boots. Something moved across her face. Grief contained. His nephew, Henry, his sister's boy. Tucker raised him for 2 years while his sister was ill. Henry went back to his mother when she recovered. That was 6 years ago. She paused. Tucker's never had the heart to get rid of the boots. Flora looked at the 3 small pairs of boots and understood that she was standing in the archaeology of a man's affections, all the things he'd loved, and hadn't been able to let go of, arranged quietly in a mudroom, where he'd see them every time he came in from the range. She thought about what Mrs. Winters had said that morning. Easy men don't build what he's built. She thought about the envelope on her nightstand. The truth delivered at midnight by a man who hadn't had to deliver it at all. She was not going to fall in love with Tucker Blackburn. That was not something she had any intention of doing. But she realized with a kind of resignation, going to have to dramatically revise her understanding of who he was. He came in at noon, and she was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Winters sort dried beans. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because having idle hands made her anxious, and sorting beans was honest, useful work. Tucker stopped in the kitchen doorway, and she felt his presence before she looked up, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before the rain arrives. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, then catching himself, "Flora." "Tucker," she said, trying the name out loud for the first time. It sat in her mouth strangely like a word in a language she was just beginning to learn. "I'm going to ride the north boundary this afternoon," he said. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you rode growing up. If you wanted to see the property—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not asking you to. I'm offering. If you want to know where you've landed, the best way is from a saddle." She looked at him. He was still in his work clothes, dusty from the morning's riding hat in hand, and standing in his own kitchen doorway. He looked for just a moment, uncertain in a way she hadn't expected from him, as if he'd rehearsed the offer and was now regretting it. "Yes," she said. "I'll ride with you." Something in his posture shifted, relaxed almost imperceptibly. "Half an hour," he said. "I'll have Cal saddle the bay mare. She's even-tempered." "I don't need even-tempered," Flora said. "I need something with some speed." Tucker looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and called over his shoulder, "Cal, saddle the roan." The roan was a beautiful, fractious animal that wanted to go faster than Flora allowed on the first half-mile, and the effort of managing it gave her something concrete to focus on, something physical that wasn't the anxiety constantly circling in the back of her mind. By the time they reached the first rise of the north boundary, she had the horse where she wanted it, and she felt the satisfaction of that, like a hand unclenching in her chest. Tucker rode beside her and said nothing for the first 15 minutes. She appreciated that. Most men felt the need to fill silence with words as though silence were an accusation. "How much of this can you actually work in a year?" she asked when they reached the highest point of the boundary line, and she could see the full width of the northern range spreading out before them. "With the crew I have, about 60% at full efficiency," he said. "I'm running 1,200 head this season, pushing toward 1,500 by fall if the grass holds." "What's your water situation?" He glanced at her, and she got the impression the question surprised him. Not because it was unintelligent, because it was exactly the right question. 3 wells in the south pasture. 2 natural springs in the north. One of the springs ran low last summer. I've got a man coming from Denver next month to assess drilling a new well. My father's issue was the East Creek drying up, Flora said. 2 years of low runoff from the mountains, and the creek dropped below usable levels. That's what broke us. Tucker was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I watched it happen. I should have—" He stopped. Flora looked at him. "Should have what?" He was looking out over the range, jaw working slightly. "I offered your father a loan 2 years ago, before the situation reached the level it did. He refused." Flora felt the weight of that settle into her bones. "He's a proud man." "Pride's a luxury," Tucker said, not cruelly, just as a fact, the way a man states a fact about weather or terrain. "Yes," Flora said. "It cost him dearly." "It cost you more." She looked at him sharply. He wasn't looking at her, still watching the range, but the words hung in the air between them with a directness she hadn't expected. "Yes," she said quietly. "It did." Tucker turned his horse. "Come on, I want to show you the spring." The spring was where she saw something she hadn't expected to see. They came around a limestone outcrop and found Wick, the young ranch hand from the dinner table, sitting on the ground beside the spring with a dog in his lap. Not just any dog, a 3-legged cattle dog old enough to be gray around the muzzle, clearly in pain from the way it held itself. Wick had his hands moving over the animal with the focused attention of someone who has done this kind of thing before. He scrambled up when he saw Tucker, and there was something in his face guilt braced for consequence. "She came up lame this morning," Wick said quickly. "I know I'm supposed to be on the east fence. I just couldn't. I didn't want to leave her out here alone." Tucker got down from his horse. He crouched beside the dog, and Flora watched him. Watched his hands move over the animal, the same way Wick's had, careful and methodical, the large hands of a man who knew how to be gentle when the situation required it. He checked the remaining legs pressed gently along the dog's spine, looked at her eyes. "How long's she been favoring the left rear?" Tucker asked. "Since this morning's drive," Wick said. "I think she took a hoof, maybe." "She didn't." Tucker looked up at Wick. "She's got a joint swelling, old injury flaring up. She needs rest and cold compresses." He stood. "Take her to the barn and get her settled. Mrs. Winters has a poultice she uses. Tell her I sent you." He paused. "And Wick." Wick looked up braced. "The east fence will wait," Tucker said. "The dog needed tending." Wick exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for a long time. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Flora watched Tucker mount his horse again, and she thought about Mrs. Winters. "That morning I've seen him sit with a dying calf through an entire night, so it wouldn't be alone." She thought about 3 small pairs of boots in a mudroom. She thought about a loan offered and refused and never mentioned until it was too late. She thought about how quickly a person's understanding of another person could be dismantled and rebuilt by a series of small, unglamorous moments of decency. She was afraid of him still. She hadn't stopped being afraid. It was too early for that, and fear wasn't something that dissolved just because the evidence didn't support it. But the fear was changing shape. It was losing the quality of dread and acquiring something more like caution. And caution, she knew from experience, was a manageable thing. The twist came over supper, and it came from Pete Duval, and it cracked the careful surface of the day wide open. Pete had come in from the south pasture with a look on his face that Flora had learned to read in a single day, the look of a man who's carrying bad news and isn't sure how the room is going to take it. "Ryder came through this afternoon," Pete said, setting his fork down, "while you were on the north boundary." He looked at Tucker. "From Hargrove." The name dropped into the dinner table conversation like a stone into still water. Tucker's expression didn't change, but something in the air around him changed. "What did he want?" "Hargrove says the buyout wasn't clean," Pete said carefully. "He says there's a secondary note attached to the Newsom property, one that didn't come up in the settlement." He paused. "He's claiming the land itself, not the debt, the actual land, as collateral for a separate agreement he says Edmund Newsom signed in March." Flora put down her fork. "What kind of agreement?" she asked. Pete looked at her with something careful in his expression, as if he hadn't expected her to speak. Then he looked back at Tucker. "He says if the note isn't paid in full within 30 days, the east parcel of the Newsom Ranch, the original homestead acreage, becomes his property by legal right." He paused. "He's already engaged a lawyer out of Pueblo." Flora felt the blood leave her face. The east parcel was the original land her grandfather had homesteaded. The house stood on it. Her father's house, the one she'd grown up in, the one her mother had died in, the one Edmund Newsom would have nothing without. "How much is the note?" Tucker said. $400. The table was very quiet. Flora looked at Tucker. She couldn't read his expression. It had gone to someplace interior, somewhere he was working through numbers and options and contingencies she wasn't privy to. She felt the sudden humiliating awareness that her family's fate was still being decided by the men around her, and the rage that moved through her at that realization was different from the grief of the wedding day, sharper, more particular, more useful. "Tucker," she said. He looked at her. "Is Hargrove's claim legally sound?" she asked. "Or is he manufacturing pressure?" Something shifted in Tucker's expression. The interiority gave way to attention, to a kind of focused respect that she hadn't seen directed at her before. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I need to see the document." "Then get the document," Flora said. "Before you do anything else, get the document. My father would have signed his name to anything Hargrove put in front of him last March. That was when things were worst. But a man desperate enough to sign anything is also desperate enough to sign something that isn't enforceable." She held his gaze. "I want to see it." "Flora," Pete started. "I'm not asking your opinion, Pete," she said without heat. Then back to Tucker. "Do you have a lawyer?" "In Denver," Tucker said. "Send for him tonight." Flora said. If Hargrove has a lawyer and we don't, we're already behind. Tucker looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that takes full measure of a person. Cal Briggs at the far end of the table had set down his coffee and was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Cal, Tucker said, still looking at Flora. Ride to the telegraph office after supper. Send word to Harrison in Denver. Tell him I need him in Copper Creek by Thursday. Yes, sir, Cal said. Tucker picked up his fork. We eat first, he said. Everything else after. Flora picked up her fork too. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. The anger was still there at Hargrove, at her father, at the entire architecture of debt and obligation that had been built around her without her knowledge, but the anger was clarifying rather than paralyzing. She would not let this man Hargrove, whoever he was, take her father's house. She would not. After supper, Tucker found her in the library. She had taken down one of the law books from the upper shelf. There were 3 of them, and their spines were as cracked as the cattle manuals, and she was standing at the desk with it open, scanning for anything relevant to land notes and collateral claims in Colorado territory. Tucker stopped in the doorway. You're not going to find the specific answer in there, he said. But the general framework is sound. I know, Flora said. I'm not looking for the answer. I'm learning the vocabulary. I can't talk to your lawyer intelligently if I don't know what I'm talking about. He came into the room and looked at the page she had open. He stood close enough that she was aware of him in the particular way she'd been aware of him since that kitchen doorway this afternoon, not with dread exactly, but with a heightened attention, a tracking of position and intent. My father didn't tell me about this note either, she said quietly. I know. How long have you known Hargrove was a problem? Tucker was quiet for a moment. I suspected he might be when I bought out the debt. He's not a man who lets go of leverage easily. I thought the buyout would satisfy him. I was wrong. You should have told me, Flora said. She looked up at him. He met her eyes. Yes, I should have. 2 honest concessions in 2 days. She wasn't keeping count, but she noticed. When your lawyer comes, Flora said, I want to be in the room. I wasn't planning to keep you out of the room. Some men would. I'm not some men, Tucker said, and said it without pride, just as information the way he said most things. She looked back at the book. Tell me about Hargrove. Everything you know. Tucker pulled the chair from the desk and sat down. And for the next hour he talked, and she listened, and asked questions, and pushed back when something didn't fit. And the library filled with the sound of 2 people who were not yet comfortable with each other, but had found in crisis a kind of functional trust that ordinary time might have taken months to build. Outside, the Colorado night pressed against the windows, and somewhere to the south, her father was in his house, the house that was possibly about to be taken from him, and he didn't know it yet. Flora closed the law book and pressed her fingers flat against its cover. My father didn't tell me the full debt because he was ashamed, she said. And he probably signed Hargrove's note in March for the same reason he needed the money, and he was afraid to ask for help because asking for help meant admitting how bad it had gotten. She paused. Proud men make expensive mistakes. Yes, Tucker said. They do. I am not a proud woman, Flora said. She looked at him directly. I want you to understand that. I am not too proud to ask for help. Too proud to admit ignorance, too proud to change my mind when the facts change. She held his gaze. But I need to know what I'm actually dealing with. All of it. Not the version that's been edited to protect my feelings. Tucker was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. All right, you agree, or all right, you're humoring me. All right, I agree, he said. And there was something in his voice deliberate weighted that made her believe him. She nodded once. Then tell me the rest of it, she said. Whatever else you haven't told me yet. Tell me now before we go any further into this. Tucker leaned forward in the chair and put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she was beginning to understand did not hide as much as they held back information stored carefully released when it was earned. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. Hargrove has been trying to acquire land on the Copper Creek Valley floor for 3 years, Tucker said. Not just your father's land. Mine. The Kemper property south of town. The old Pratt homestead. He wants the whole valley floor and he's been buying debt to get it. He paused. Your father's land is the last piece he needs to control the watershed. If he gets that east parcel, he controls the water access for every downstream operation in the valley, including mine. Flora stared at him. So this isn't about my father's debt, she said slowly. Your father's debt is the instrument, Tucker said. The land is the prize, and the water is what makes the land worth having. The full shape of it arranged itself in front of her like a landscape emerging from morning fog. Hargrove wasn't a creditor pressing a debtor. He was a strategist dismantling a valley piece by piece, and her family's desperation had handed him the last piece he needed. He planned this, she said. I believe so, yes. He let my father get into debt, she said. Maybe made it worse, and then offered the loan in March, knowing my father would sign and knowing he couldn't repay. That's what I believe, Tucker said. I need the document to prove it. Flora stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to him for a moment, and the cold fury that moved through her was nothing like the grief of yesterday or the fear of this morning. It was focused and specific and entirely actionable, and she recognized it as the same quality that had gotten her through every hard thing she'd faced in her 20 years. She turned around. We're going to beat him, she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a declaration exactly. It was a statement of fact delivered with the flat certainty of a woman who has decided something and is informing the room. Tucker looked at her. And for the first time since she had met him, Tucker Blackburn smiled. Not a large smile, not the kind that takes over a face. Just a small particular movement at the corner of his mouth, the kind that comes when something surprises you in a way you welcome. Yes, he said. We are. Flora. Newsom. She corrected herself without thinking. Flora Blackburn nodded once and picked up the law book again. There was work to do. Harrison Doyle arrived from Denver on Thursday morning 40 minutes before Flora had expected him, and that alone told her something useful about the man. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s, lean with the slightly ink-stained fingers of someone who spent more time at a desk than a courtroom, but whose eyes moved around a room with the quick precision of a person who missed very little. He shook Tucker's hand, nodded to Cal Briggs, and then looked at Flora with an expression of polite assessment. Mrs. Blackburn, he said. Mr. Doyle. She gestured to the chairs she'd arranged in Tucker's office the night before. She'd spent an hour in there after Tucker went to bed, organizing the papers she had access to, flagging what she thought was relevant, making a list of questions in a hand that grew steadier as the night went on. Sit down. We have a great deal to cover. Harrison Doyle sat down and looked at the organized papers, and then at Flora, and then at Tucker, with an expression that was trying not to be amused. Tucker said nothing. Flora had noticed he had a gift for saying nothing at the right moment. You've reviewed the situation, Harrison asked. I've reviewed what I have access to, Flora said, which is the settlement documentation from Tucker's buyout of the primary debt, Hargrove's original loan agreement from 18 months ago, and the county land records for the Newsom East parcel that Tucker requested from the courthouse yesterday. She paused. What I don't have is the document my father signed in March. That's what I need you to get. Harrison looked at her for a moment. Getting that document requires Hargrove to produce it, which requires either his cooperation or a court order. Then pursue the court order, Flora said. That takes time we may not. We have 30 days from the date of Hargrove's notice, Flora said. How long for the order? A week if Judge Calloway is sympathetic. Is he sympathetic? To Hargrove historically somewhat. Flora felt the cold edge of that land against her. She had anticipated that men like Hargrove didn't operate without cultivating the right relationships, but hearing it confirmed made the challenge sharper and more specific. Then we don't go to Calloway. Who else sits the district? Harrison blinked. Tucker made a sound that might have been something caught between a cough and a laugh quickly suppressed. Judge Alma Reeves sits the Northern District, Harrison said carefully. She's based in Salida. She is... He paused, choosing words considerably less warm to Hargrove's style of business. How do we get this in front of her instead of Calloway? We'd need grounds to argue the case belongs in her jurisdiction. The Newsom property straddles the county line. It's arguable. Then argue it, Flora said. That's what Tucker pays you for. Harrison Doyle looked at Tucker again. Tucker picked up his coffee cup. Don't look at me, Tucker said. She's right. Harrison opened his briefcase and got to work. The first full week on the ranch settled into a rhythm that Flora hadn't anticipated, partly because she'd expected chaos, and partly because she'd expected resistance, and she got neither in the form she'd prepared for. The ranch hands adjusted to her the way animals adjust to a new element in their environment, cautiously at first, then with increasing normality, then with the unconscious ease of familiarity. Pete Duvall stopped reaching past her for things at the table. Wick, whose real name she'd learned was William Greer, but who'd been Wick since childhood, due to a candle-related incident nobody fully explained, started bringing his morning coffee to wherever she was working and talking at her in the comfortable, unself-conscious way of a man who had decided she was safe. You from cattle country originally? Wick asked on the fifth morning, watching her help Mrs. Winters put up the week's preserves. My father ran cattle until the drought hit, Flora said. Mostly we were wheat and corn the last few years. He was trying to diversify. That's smart, Wick said. It wasn't enough, Flora said. Smart and enough aren't the same thing. Wick nodded like this was a piece of genuine wisdom he intended to keep. He was 22 and had an open, earnest quality that reminded her painfully of what innocence looked like before the world got its hands on it. Mr. Blackburn's been different this week, Wick said carefully, as if testing whether the observation was welcome. Flora kept her hands in the preserving jars. Different how? Just... Wick thought about it. He comes in for lunch now. He never used to. He'd eat in the saddle or not at all, and Mrs. Winters would leave something cold for him on the kitchen table. A pause. He came in for lunch every day this week. Flora didn't say anything. She filed it the way she'd been filing things since she arrived carefully in the room inside her mind, where she kept facts she didn't know what to do with yet. Hi. Tucker came in for lunch that day and found her at his desk. She was not going through his papers. She had a firm principle about that, which was that she would not touch anything that wasn't offered or explicitly relevant to Hargrove. But she had pulled her own list of questions back out and was working through them against the county records Harrison had sent copies of, and she'd been so absorbed in it that she hadn't heard the door. I'm sorry, she said, starting to rise. I can move to the library. Stay, Tucker said. He hung his hat and went to the washstand in the corner and cleaned his hands with the efficiency of a man performing a habitual action. What did you find? She settled back. The east parcel boundary, she said. Look at this. She spread the land record on the desk and pointed. The survey from 1869 puts the eastern edge of the Newsom property at the Dry Creek bed. But Hargrove's loan document, the one from 18 months ago, describes the collateral using the 1871 survey, which shifted the boundary line 40 feet west after a dispute with the Kemper family. Tucker came to the desk. He leaned over the records close enough that she was aware of his presence in that particular way again, that heightened alertness, that was not fear anymore, but something she didn't have a precise name for. Not yet. That 40 feet, Tucker said, contains the spring access, Flora said. If you use the 1871 survey, Hargrove's collateral claim includes the spring. If you use the 1869 survey, which is the original federal land grant, it doesn't. She looked up at him. My father almost certainly didn't know the difference between the two surveys. Hargrove did. Tucker was quiet for a moment, looking at the records. He built the boundary discrepancy into the loan agreement deliberately, Tucker said. I believe so. I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is what Harrison needs to look at. Tucker straightened up. Write it out, he said. Everything you've found exactly the way you just explained it to me. I'll send it to Harrison this afternoon." Flora looked at him. "I've been operating in your office." "I noticed." "You don't mind?" He looked at her with those gray eyes that held more than they revealed. "Flora, you've spent the last 5 days trying to protect your father's land using resources you didn't have a week ago in a house you didn't choose, married to a man you didn't want." He picked up his hat. "Why would I mind?" She didn't have an answer for that. He was at the door before she found her voice. "Tucker." He turned. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully without qualification, without the undertone of resentment that had colored everything she'd said to him in the first 2 days. He nodded once. "Come eat something," he said. "Mrs. Winters made soup." The letter from her father arrived on the 8th day. It was not a long letter. Edmund Newsom was not a man given to long letters, but it was the most honest thing he'd written to her in years, and she could tell it had cost him in the way that honesty costs a proud man in full up front, without the comfort of euphemism. "Flora," he wrote, "I have heard from Hargrove's man. I know what I signed in March, and I know what it means, and I am sorrier than I know how to say for not having told you the full extent of things before the ceremony. I was ashamed. That is the only explanation I have, and I know it is not sufficient. I am told Tucker Blackburn has engaged a lawyer. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what to make of a great deal these days. I hope you are well. I hope he is treating you with decency. Your mother would want me to ask." Flora read it twice, sitting on the edge of her bed. Then she folded it and held it against her knee, and let herself feel all the complicated things the letter contained. The love that was real, and the failure that was also real. The two things wound together so tightly that separating them was impossible, like trying to pull the threads of a finished piece of cloth apart without destroying the fabric. She wrote back that evening. She told him she was well. She told him Tucker was treating her with decency, and then because she'd promised herself she wouldn't traffic in the same comfortable half-truths her father had used. She crossed that out and wrote, "Tucker is treating me with more respect and honesty than I expected from anyone in these circumstances. I am adjusting. The East parcel is not lost yet. I am working on it." She signed it. "Your daughter Flora," and then, after a pause she couldn't explain, added, "Do not be too proud to let Tucker's lawyer help you. It costs you nothing, and it may save everything." She gave the letter to Cal Briggs to post in the morning. She did not tell Tucker what it said. But when she came down for breakfast, and he was already at the table, already with his coffee, and he looked up and saw something in her face that he apparently felt required no explanation, and he simply poured her a cup and slid it across. Without comment, she found that she was grateful for his particular brand of quiet, in a way she hadn't anticipated. The wire from Harrison Doyle came on the 10th day, and it arrived during supper, and Pete Duval read it aloud, because Tucker's hands were dirty from the afternoon's work, and he hadn't made it to the washstand yet, and the words fell into the room with the weight of a change in weather. Judge Reeves has agreed jurisdiction. Hargrove ordered to produce March document within 7 days. Boundary discrepancy argument accepted for review. Prepare your witnesses. This is winnable. Harrison. The table went very quiet. Then Cal Briggs picked up his coffee cup and said, "Well, all right then." Wick looked at Flora with an expression of open, uncomplicated admiration that she found both touching and embarrassing. "You found the boundary thing," he said. "Didn't you?" "Harrison found it," Flora said. "You found it." Pete Duval said, which was the most he'd said to her directly in 10 days, and said with a quiet certainty that landed differently than she expected. She looked at Tucker. He was looking back at her. The supper table was between them, and the wire was in Pete's hand, and the rest of the ranch hands were in various states of relieved animation. But for just a moment, it was as though none of that existed, and it was simply the two of them, in the same room, holding the same understanding of what had just shifted. "Eat your supper," Tucker said. To everyone but his eyes were on her. She ate. But her hands were trembling slightly, and this time it wasn't from fear. The document Hargrove produced under judicial compulsion, delivered to Harrison Doyle's office in Salida, with the evident reluctance of a man surrendering a weapon, was worse than Flora had expected in its details, and better than she'd hoped in its flaws. Harrison sent a copy by courier, and Flora and Tucker sat with it in the office on the 12th morning of her marriage and read it together. This was the new normal. She realized the two of them in the office or the library, the formal distance of the first days, replaced by the functional proximity of two people engaged in a shared problem. He leaned over the desk to point at clauses. She read passages aloud when she found something. They argued about interpretation, not cruelly, but with the direct friction of two people who each had a clear point of view, and the arguing felt more like real conversation than anything else they'd done together. "Here," she said, pointing. "He uses the phrase right of recovery upon default. That's standard. But look at how he defines default. He doesn't tie it to a missed payment. He ties it to the value of the collateral falling below the loan amount, which means he didn't need Edmund to miss a payment. He just needed the land's assessed value to drop, which it did during the drought, which Hargrove knew it would." Tucker's jaw tightened. "He triggered default before your father even had a chance to repay." "Exactly. My father probably didn't even know he'd defaulted. He was still making whatever arrangements he could when Hargrove already had the legal mechanism in place." She set the document down. "This isn't a loan agreement. It's a trap." "Harrison can argue predatory terms," Tucker said. "Harrison needs to argue more than that," Flora said. "He needs to argue that Hargrove induced the signature through deliberate misrepresentation. If my father can testify that Hargrove described this as a standard loan, if he never explained the valuation-based default trigger, then the contract may not be enforceable at all." Tucker looked at her. "Your father would need to testify," he said carefully. "I know that. He'd be standing in a courtroom admitting publicly that he signed a document he didn't fully read or understand." "I know that too," Flora said. Her voice was even. "He's a proud man. It will cost him a great deal. But it's the truth, and it's the only thing that might actually work, and I would rather see my father humbled in a courtroom than see him lose the house his father built." She met Tucker's eyes. "I'll write to him myself. I'll explain what needs to happen." Tucker was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, "I'll go with you when you talk to him." She blinked. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Tucker said. "I'm offering." She thought about what that offer meant. Tucker Blackburn, the man her father had essentially sold her to, riding back to the Newsom ranch to help the man who'd made the sale. The complicated architecture of it was almost laughable. And yet, there was no artifice in Tucker's offer. No calculation she could detect. "Why?" she asked. "Because Edmund Newsom is your father," Tucker said simply. "And you're my wife." It was the first time he'd used the word directly and deliberately, not in a document, not as a formality, but as a statement of fact about their relationship and what it meant to him. It sat in the room between them, and she felt it land somewhere specific in her chest, and she didn't know what to do with it. So she did the thing she did with all the things she didn't know what to do with. Yet she filed it carefully in that room inside her mind, and she kept her voice steady. "All right," she said. "We'll go Saturday." They rode to the Newsom ranch on Saturday, and it was the first time Flora had seen her father since the wedding, and it was harder than she'd expected and exactly as necessary. Edmund Newsom came out onto the porch when he heard horses, and when he saw Flora, he stopped walking and stood there, and she could see from 20 yards the effort it cost him to hold himself together. She got down from the roan before Tucker had finished tying his horse, and she crossed the yard in 12 steps, and she put her arms around her father, and he held her tightly, the way he hadn't held her since she was small. And neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched long and full. Then Edmund Newsom looked up and saw Tucker standing at the yard gate, hat in hand, at a respectful distance, and something complicated moved across the older man's face, shame and gratitude, so tangled together they were indistinguishable. Tucker walked forward. He didn't extend his hand for Edmund to shake. He waited, letting the older man decide the terms of the greeting. Edmund Newsom extended his hand. Tucker shook it. "Mr. Newsom," he said, "we need to talk about Hargrove. Your daughter has found something important." They sat at the kitchen table, where the debt conversation had happened, where the cold coffee had been, where the word arrangement had been placed so carefully over the truth like a cloth. And Flora explained everything. The boundary discrepancy, the valuation default clause, the predatory structure of the March agreement. She explained it without anger because anger wasn't what her father needed from her right now, and without softening it because softness wasn't what the situation required. Edmund Newsom listened. He got older looking as she talked, each detail adding weight to his face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I need you to testify," Flora said. "I need you to tell a judge that Hargrove described this as a standard loan and never explained the terms that would trigger default. If that's true, if that's what happened, I need you to say it in a courtroom." Her father's jaw worked. She could see the pride sitting on him like a physical weight. "It's the truth," Edmund said quietly. He said it was straightforward. He said I had 2 years to repay, and the land was just formality, just paperwork. "Then say that," Flora said. "Say exactly that to a judge who is not sympathetic to Hargrove, in front of a lawyer who has already found 3 other structural problems with that document." She leaned forward. "Papa, I am not asking you to invent anything. I am asking you to tell the truth about what happened to you." Edmund looked at Tucker. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, not accusingly, just genuinely asking. Tucker was quiet for a moment. "Because Hargrove has been doing this to this valley for 3 years, he said. "Your land is the last piece he needs. If he gets it, a lot of people downstream of that spring lose water access, including operations that have been in families for 2 generations. He paused. "And because your daughter asked me to. That's reason enough." Edmund Newsom looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he said, "All right, I'll testify." The testimony hearing before Judge Reeves in Salida was scheduled for the 22nd day after Hargrove's notice, and in the 8 days between Saturday at the Newsom kitchen table and the morning they left for Salida, the ranch ran at its ordinary pace. Cattle fences, water checks, morning coffee supper. While underneath that ordinary pace, something was building between Tucker and Flora that neither of them was naming yet. It announced itself in small things the way significant things usually do. Tucker had begun asking her opinion, not performing the gesture of actually asking, and waiting for the answer, and adjusting his thinking when the answer was good. He asked her what she thought about moving the south herd to the upper pasture 2 weeks early, given the spring grass was ahead of schedule. She thought they should wait 1 more week and let the lower pasture recover more fully before pulling the cattle off it. He waited the week. The lower pasture was better for it. He told Cal Briggs to route the morning reports through her when he was out on the North Range. Cal Briggs did without visible resentment, which she understood was significant. A man like Cal Briggs, 20 years in cattle work, twice her age, didn't defer to a woman because he was told to. He deferred because the woman had earned something. She wasn't sure when she'd earned it, but she recognized the moment she understood she had. It was on the 16th morning when Pete Duvall came to her before he went to. Tucker came to her first, specifically with a question about the Eastwater rotation, and she answered him, and his answer went into action, and Tucker came back at noon and saw the result of it, and nodded approvingly, and didn't ask who'd made the call. He knew. She knew he knew. That evening after supper, Tucker came to find her in the library. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her to the office and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, a place she had never touched, and took out a ledger. He set it on the desk in front of her. "This is the full financial record of the ranch," he said. "Everything that comes in, everything that goes out, every debt, every asset, every contingency fund." He opened it. "I want you to know what this operation actually looks like." Flora looked at the ledger. Then she looked at him. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's yours," Tucker said. "Half of it legally as my wife, but more than that." He stopped, tried again. Because you have been operating in this house and on this land for 16 days without the information you'd need to actually understand where you've landed. That's not fair to you." He paused. "And because I think if you understand this operation, really understand it, you'll stop being afraid of it. And I'd rather have you unafraid." Flora looked at the ledger. It was meticulous, every entry in Tucker's large, impatient hand, every column balanced, every contingency accounted for. It was the financial record of a man who had never let himself be surprised by numbers. She thought about her father, and his cold coffee, and his hidden debt, and the contrast was so sharp it made her breath catch. "You're nothing like what I thought you were," she said. Tucker closed the ledger. "What did you think I was?" "Ruthless," she said. "Cold. A man who got what he wanted because he took it. And now?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider everything. "I think you're a man who gets what he wants because he works for it and plans for it and doesn't flinch when it's hard," she said. "And I think somewhere along the way, people mistook the not flinching for cruelty." She paused. "It isn't cruelty. It's just not everyone has it." Tucker looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, and she felt the shift in the room, something tipping towards something else, some new configuration that she wasn't ready to name. "Flora," he said. "Don't," she said quietly, not unkindly, just firmly. He understood. She could see that he understood that the don't was not a rejection, but a not yet, and that the difference mattered. He nodded once. He picked up the ledger. "We leave for Salida at 6 on Thursday," he said. "I'll be ready," she said. He left the office. She stood alone in the room for a moment with the lamp and the quiet, and she pressed her hand against her sternum, where the not yet feeling lived, and she told herself very firmly that she was still afraid, and that the fear was reasonable, and that trust was not a door you walked through in 16 days. But she also told herself the truth because she had promised herself honesty and she intended to keep it. The door was open. She had opened it herself without quite noticing she'd done it, and she didn't entirely mind. The morning they left for Salida, Tucker found her already at the wagon at 5:45. She had her father's letter in her coat pocket, the one he'd sent after Saturday, confirming his testimony written in the careful hand of a man trying to be better than his shame. And she had Harrison Doyle's full brief in a satchel at her feet, and she had slept 4 hours because her mind wouldn't stop moving through the possibilities. Tucker looked at her. "You've been up since 3, he said. It wasn't a question. 2, she admitted. He took the satchel from her and stowed it in the wagon without comment. He helped her up his hand at her elbow, brief and certain, and then he was up beside her, and they pulled out of the yard with the sun just beginning to color the edge of the eastern sky. They rode for a while without talking. Then Tucker said, "We're going to win this." Flora looked at the road ahead. "I know," she said. She said it the way he'd said things to her from the beginning, plainly without decoration, as a fact about the world that she had decided was true and intended to make true by whatever means necessary. Tucker nodded. The wagon moved north toward Salida, and her father's letter sat warm in her pocket, and Tucker Blackburn's shoulder was 6 inches from hers, and the fear that had lived in her chest since the morning she'd stood in the church in her mother's dress was still there, but it had moved. It had relocated from the center of her chest to somewhere peripheral. Something else was taking up the center now. She didn't name it yet, but she let it be there. Judge Alma Reeves was a woman of 60 who wore her silver hair pinned back with the same no-nonsense efficiency she applied to her courtroom, and she looked at Hargrove's lawyer the way a person looks at something tracked in on the bottom of a boot. Not with anger exactly, but with the particular weariness of someone who has seen this specific kind of mess too many times to find it interesting. The hearing room in Salida was not a grand courtroom. It was a working room, wooden chairs, a long table, 2 windows that let in the flat morning light of the San Luis Valley. Hargrove sat on one side with his lawyer, a heavy-set man from Pueblo named Croft, who had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds. Harrison Doyle sat on the other side with Tucker Flora and Edmund Newsom, who had ridden up from Copper Creek the evening before and spent the night in the hotel down the street, looking like a man walking toward something he deserved and dreaded equally. Flora had not slept. She was past the point where sleep deprivation registered as tiredness. She was operating on something cleaner and colder than rest. She had her notes. She had the ledger of questions she and Harrison had worked through the night before. She had her father sitting 3 feet to her left, and she had Tucker sitting 3 feet to her right, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to feel genuinely flanked by people who were on her side. Judge Reeves opened the proceedings without ceremony. "Mr. Croft," she said, "your client claims right of recovery on a March agreement. Produce the document and explain the default trigger." Croft stood. He was smooth, practiced, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who understood that confidence was half the argument. He presented the March document and explained the valuation clause in language designed to make it sound standard inevitable, a perfectly ordinary feature of a commercial loan agreement. Harrison let him finish. Then he stood. "Your Honor." Harrison said, "The document Mr. Croft has presented contains a default trigger tied not to payment failure, but to land valuation. A valuation that Mr. Hargrove himself was in a position to influence, given that he simultaneously held debt on 3 adjacent properties that depressed comparable sales in the Copper Creek Valley during the period in question." Croft's smooth expression flickered. Harrison kept going. "Furthermore, the collateral description in the document uses the 1871 survey boundary, which conflicts with the original federal land grant from 1869. The 1871 survey was the product of a private boundary dispute with a neighboring property and was never formally recorded with the Territory Land Office. It has no legal standing as a property boundary definition." He paused, letting that sit. "Mr. Hargrove's collateral claim therefore describes property using a boundary that does not legally exist." The room was very quiet. Judge Reeves looked at Croft. "Mr. Croft, your response." Croft recovered quickly. Flora had to give him that. He argued that common usage of the 1871 boundary had established it as the operative boundary, regardless of recording status, and that the valuation clause was disclosed in the document itself and therefore constituted informed consent. "Was it explained verbally?" Judge Reeves asked, cutting through Croft's argument with the efficiency of a woman who had no patience for tangents. "At the time of signing." Croft hesitated. 1 full second. "In a courtroom, 1 full second is a long time. We would need the borrower's testimony on that point," he said. "Convenient," Judge Reeves said dryly. "Mr. Doyle, call your witness." Edmund Newsom took the chair across from Judge Reeves, and Flora watched her father the way she'd been watching him since he arrived the night before, with the anxious attention of someone tracking a structure that might hold or might not, depending on forces she couldn't entirely control. He was sober. He was clean-shaven. He was wearing the good coat he'd worn to her mother's funeral, which told her he understood the gravity of this in the deepest way he knew how to express it. Harrison walked him through it carefully. The circumstances of March, the drought, the state of the debt, the meeting with Hargrove at the Copper Creek Hotel, which Hargrove had arranged, at which Hargrove had presented the loan as a simple bridge, 2 years standard terms, land as formality, just paperwork. Did Mr. Hargrove explain that the loan could enter default based on land valuation rather than missed payments? Harrison asked. Edmund Newsom looked at his hands for a moment. "No," he said. His voice was quiet but completely steady. "He did not. He said I had 2 years to repay. He said the land was collateral in name only. He said it was standard." He paused. "I believed him because I needed to believe him. I know that's not an excuse, but that is what happened." The room was very still. Hargrove, for the first time since the hearing began, was not looking at the table in front of him with comfortable detachment. He was looking at Edmund Newsom, and his expression had acquired a tightness around the jaw that Flora recognized as controlled anger. Good, she thought. Harrison said, "No further questions." Croft stood for cross-examination. He was still smooth, but the smoothness had a slightly desperate quality, now the polish of a man covering a crack. "Mr. Nuzom," Croft said, "you've testified that you didn't understand the terms, but you signed the document. As an adult of sound mind, surely you bore some responsibility for reading what you signed." Edmund Nuzom looked at Croft. "Yes," he said simply. "I did. And I am standing here telling a judge that I failed in that responsibility and that I was taken advantage of by a man who knew I was desperate and used that desperation against me." He paused. "I imagine that's not the answer you were hoping for." There was a sound from the observer's side of the room, a single, quickly suppressed sound that might have been a laugh. Judge Reeves did not quite smile, but something moved through her expression that was adjacent to it. Croft sat down. The hearing broke at noon. Judge Reeves said she would have a ruling by 2 o'clock, and Croft immediately requested an extension for additional argument, which the judge denied, with a brevity that suggested she'd heard enough additional argument to last her through the decade. Flora Tucker Harrison and Edmund Nuzom ate lunch at the hotel dining room, and it was the strangest meal Flora had experienced since the wedding supper. The four of them around a table, with the particular charged atmosphere of people who have done everything they can do and are now waiting on the world to respond. Edmund ate almost nothing. Flora put a roll on his plate. "Eat something, Papa." "I'm not hungry." "I don't care. Eat something anyway." He picked up the roll, and she caught Tucker watching this exchange, with an expression. She was becoming increasingly able to read a quiet attentiveness, the expression of a man who notices things and stores them without editorial comment. After a moment, Edmund looked across the table at Tucker. "I owe you an apology," Edmund said. Tucker looked at him steadily. "I put my daughter in an impossible position," Edmund said. "I told myself it was for her benefit. It wasn't. It was because I'd run out of other options and she was—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "She was the only thing I had left that anyone wanted." The table was very quiet. Flora felt the words land somewhere old and painful in her chest. Not with fresh anger, but with the dull ache of a truth she'd already known and had not needed to hear aloud. She kept her hands in her lap and her face still. Tucker said, "You did what desperate men do, Mr. Nuzom. It doesn't excuse it, but I understand it." A pause. "Flora has not been poorly treated in my house. I want you to know that." Edmund looked at his daughter. "I know," Edmund said quietly. "She told me." Another pause. "She also told me you came to her room on the first night to tell her the full amount of the debt. That you didn't have to do that." "I didn't," Tucker agreed. "Why did you?" Tucker picked up his coffee. "Because she deserved to know what she'd walked into, and because I wanted to be the kind of man she could trust eventually." He set the cup down. "I figured telling her the truth on the first night was the best start I could make." Edmund Nuzom looked at Tucker Blackburn for a long moment, the kind of look that takes full inventory. Then he nodded slowly and picked up his fork. Flora looked at her plate. She was not going to cry at this lunch table. She was absolutely not going to cry. She ate her meal with great concentration. Under the table, Tucker's hand found hers briefly. Just a touch, just his fingers against her knuckles present, and then gone. She didn't look up, but she felt it all the way up her arm. Judge Reeves ruled at 2:15. The March agreement was voided on 2 grounds. First, the boundary description relied on an unrecorded survey with no legal standing, making the collateral definition legally defective. Second, the valuation-based default trigger constituted a material term that had not been disclosed to the borrower at the time of signing, rendering the clause unenforceable under good faith contract standards. Hargrove's claim on the Nuzom East parcel was dismissed in full. Croft immediately began arguing grounds for appeal. Judge Reeves told him he was welcome to pursue it, that the Territory Court of Appeals was in Denver, and that she hoped he had a comfortable coat for the winter months, because that process would take considerably longer than this hearing had. Her tone suggested she was not especially concerned about the appeal. The hearing room cleared. Flora stood in the corridor outside and felt the relief move through her in a single long wave. Not euphoric, not victorious. Just the particular quality of relief that comes when a weight you've been carrying so long, you've forgotten its shape is finally lifted, and your body has to relearn how to stand without it. Her father hugged her in the corridor, and this time she let herself cry briefly against his shoulder with the contained efficiency of a woman who had decided she was allowed 2 minutes and not a second more. "Thank you," Edmund said into her hair. "Flora, thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank Tucker. And be honest with people from now on, Papa, starting with yourself." She pulled back and wiped her face with her sleeve and squared her shoulders. And Edmund Newsom looked at his daughter with something in his expression that she recognized the same look he'd given her when she was 8 years old and had fixed the water pump by herself while he was in town. Pride. The unqualified kind. Harrison Doyle shook hands all around and said he would send the final documentation within the week. He clapped Tucker on the shoulder and said, "Your wife found the boundary argument, you know. I just wrote it up." Tucker looked at Flora. "I know," he said. They rode back to the Blackburn Ranch the next morning. Just the two of them. Edmund had returned to Copper Creek the previous evening, and Tucker and Flora had stayed the night at the hotel in separate rooms with the easy practicality that had become the natural operating mode of their arrangement, or what had been their arrangement. Flora was becoming increasingly aware that arrangement was no longer the right word for what this was. Arrangements didn't involve a man's hand finding yours under a lunch table. Arrangements didn't involve two people working through law books together at midnight, or arguing about cattle rotations, or sitting in comfortable silence on a wagon seat for 40 miles, because the silence between them had lost its strangeness and become something else entirely. She was thinking about this, not quite ready to examine it directly, circling it the way you circle a fire to gauge its heat before you decide how close you're willing to stand, when Tucker said without preamble, "Harrison asked me yesterday before the hearing whether this was a real marriage." Flora looked at him. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him it was becoming one," Tucker said. He kept his eyes on the road. "I want you to know I said that, and I want you to know I meant it, and I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not saying that to put pressure on you. I know where we started. I know what the first morning felt like for you, and I know I can't undo that, and I don't think you should pretend it didn't happen." Another pause. "But I want to be honest with you. That's the one thing I've tried to be from the beginning." Flora was quiet for a long moment. The road ran north through the valley, and the sky was the deep October blue of high-altitude autumn, and the roan was moving at a comfortable pace, and everything was very still. "It is becoming one," Flora said finally. Tucker turned to look at her. "I'm not there yet," she said. "I need you to know that too, because honesty goes both directions. I can't—" She took a breath. "There are things I haven't sorted out yet, about what I feel and what I want and what I'm allowed to want given how this began." She met his eyes. "But I'm not afraid of you anymore." She watched something move through his expression at those words, something that had been held carefully under the surface for a long time, released very slightly now like pressure from a valve. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's more than enough." She looked back at the road. "For now," she said, and the two words carried a weight and a direction that both of them understood. The ranch received them back the way it had received them every other evening, with the ordinary business of a working operation that did not pause for human drama. Cal Briggs met them in the yard with 3 things that needed Tucker's decision, and 1 thing that needed Flora's, which she understood was Cal's way of saying that her place in this operation had been accepted at a level below conscious articulation. She made her decision. The east water rotation adjusted for the unexpected warm spell that had lasted into late October, and Cal nodded and went to implement it. And she walked into the house and found Mrs. Winters had left supper warm on the stove, and a note on the kitchen table that said simply, "Well," Flora wrote beneath it, "We won," and set the note back on the table. Mrs. Winters found it an hour later and made a sound from the kitchen that was approximately the sound of a woman who has been quietly routing for a specific outcome and has just learned she got it. Flora heard it from the library where she was sitting with the law book she didn't need anymore, but had developed a habit of keeping near, and she smiled into the page. Tucker came into the library at 9 o'clock. He sat down across from her, not at the desk, but in the chair by the window which he'd started using in the last week with the comfortable ease of a man reclaiming territory he'd been voluntarily ceding. He had a glass of bourbon. He didn't offer her one because he'd learned in the second week that she didn't drink spirits and didn't want them. He did, without comment, put a cup of tea on the table beside her. She picked it up. They sat in silence for a while, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Then Tucker said, "I want to ask you something." "All right." "When you pushed to get in front of Judge Reeves instead of Calloway, when you found the boundary argument, when you made your father agree to testify." He paused. "Did you do all of that for him, or was some of it for yourself?" Flora considered the question seriously because he'd asked it seriously. "Both," she said. "I did it for my father because I love him, and I'm not built to watch the people I love lose things without fighting for them. And I did it for myself because—" She stopped finding the right words. "Because I needed to know that being here didn't mean being powerless, that I hadn't traded one set of walls for another." She looked at him. "I needed to know that my intelligence and my judgment mattered in this life, not just in principle, in practice." Tucker looked at her for a long moment. "They do," he said, in case there was any remaining doubt. "There was," Flora said. "There's less now." He picked up his bourbon. She picked up her tea. Outside, the October wind was moving through the range with the first real edge of winter in it, and the house held them both with the particular warmth of a place that has been maintained by discipline and is only now beginning to understand what it means to be maintained by something warmer. November came, and with it the deep cold of the Colorado high country and the shift in ranch work that the cold required more indoor labor, more planning. The particular intimacy of a household closing in on itself against the weather. Flora had been on the Blackburn Ranch for 6 weeks when she understood with a certainty that arrived not as revelation, but as quiet recognition, the way you recognize a face you've seen before in a different context, that she was no longer performing the role of Tucker Blackburn's wife. She had become it. Not completely. Not without remainder. But the distance she'd maintained between herself and this life, the careful psychic gap between who I am and where I am, had closed without her noticing the exact moment it happened. She noticed it first in the way she talked about the ranch. She had started saying "our" without catching herself. She noticed it second in the way she thought about Tucker. She had started looking for him when he wasn't in a room in the unconscious manner of a person who has recalibrated their sense of where they are relative to someone else. She noticed it third on a Thursday morning in early November when she came down to find him already at the kitchen table with his coffee and the week's supply ledger, which she had started reviewing with him on Thursday mornings, because it made the ordering more efficient, and he looked up when she came in. And something in his face did what it always did when she walked into a room. He was already in that small particular shift that was not quite a smile, but was its near cousin. And she felt it in the same place. She always felt it. And she sat down across from him and picked up her half of the ledger and thought, "I am in love with this man." She didn't say it. She sat with it the way she sat with all the things she wasn't ready to release into the air between them yet. But she knew it was true, and knowing it was true was its own kind of seismic event, quiet on the surface, everything rearranging underneath. "The Northwell assessment came back from Denver," Tucker said without looking up from his ledger. "Good news or bad?" Flora asked. "Mixed. The water table is viable, but the drilling will cost more than the estimate. I want to defer the east fence expansion to cover the difference." He looked up. "What do you think?" Flora looked at her half of the ledger. "I think the east fence can wait a season. The water can't." She paused. "Do it." Tucker nodded. He made a note. Flora looked at the ledger in her hands, at the columns of numbers that represented this life, this land, this ongoing, improbable thing she had been dropped into and had somehow made her own. And she thought about a morning 6 weeks ago when she had stood in her mother's dress in a church that smelled of old hymn books and said, "I do," in a voice she didn't recognize. She recognized her voice now. It had gotten steadier since then, more certain of itself, more hers. Tucker was writing in the ledger, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and Mrs. Winters was somewhere in the house doing something purposeful, and outside the Colorado winter was pressing against the windows with the particular insistence of weather that intends to be taken seriously. Flora thought, "I came here afraid. I am still here. I built something here, or I am building it, and it is mine as much as his. And that is not what I expected, and it is also exactly what I needed." She didn't say any of it aloud, but she looked at Tucker Blackburn across the kitchen table in the November morning light, and she let herself feel the full weight of what was happening between them, let herself hold it without flinching the way she held everything she had decided to keep. Tucker looked up and caught her looking. He held her gaze for a moment. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. But she was smiling when she looked back down at the ledger, and she didn't try to stop it. And Tucker, she felt, rather than saw, it was doing something similar on his side of the table. Outside, the wind pushed against the house, and the house held the way good things do when they've been built right and cared for properly, and the morning moved forward into itself with the steady, unhurried certainty of something that intends to last. She knew before she told him. She knew for 4 days, and she carried it the way she'd carried everything difficult in her life, inward, carefully turning it over in private, until she understood its full shape, before she let it exist in the open air between herself and another person. It was December, 6 weeks past the Salida hearing. 10 weeks into a marriage that had begun as a transaction and had become by degrees so gradual she could not have named the moment of transformation, something she did not have a sufficient word for. Not just partnership, not just mutual respect, something with more heat in it than either of those words contained. She told Mrs. Winters first. Not because she planned to, it happened the way things happened between women who have shared a kitchen and a household, and the particular intimacy of daily proximity. Flora was putting up the morning coffee, and her hands stopped moving, and Mrs. Winters looked at her from across the kitchen with those clear creekwater eyes and said simply, "How far along?" Flora set the coffee pot down. "How did you know? You've been drinking your coffee black for a week," Mrs. Winters said. "You put cream in it every morning since you arrived. 3 days ago you stopped. That's either a change of preference or a change in your body, and you don't strike me as a woman who changes her preferences without a reason." Flora looked at her. 8 weeks, I think," she said. "Maybe 9. Mrs. Winters crossed the kitchen and took Flora's hands in hers, both of them firmly, the way a woman holds another woman's hands when she is offering something that doesn't have language. "Are you frightened?" "Yes," Flora said honestly. "Good," Mrs. Winters said. "Only a fool wouldn't be. But you are not a fool, and you are not alone in this house, and that man." She tilted her head in the general direction of wherever Tucker was at that moment, which was the north pasture where he'd been since 5 in the morning, is going to be undone by this news in the best possible way. She squeezed Flora's hands once. "Tell him tonight." "I know," Flora said. "Don't let it sit another day," Mrs. Winters said. "He deserves to know." Flora nodded. She picked up the coffee pot and finished what she'd started, because having something to do with her hands was the only way she knew how to manage the size of what she was feeling. She tried to tell him at supper and couldn't find the opening. The table was full, Cal Briggs, Pete Duvall Wick, and the conversation ran through the week's work with the ordinary momentum of a working ranch, and she sat through it with the news sitting in her chest like a held breath, waiting. Tucker looked at her twice across the table with the particular attention he'd developed for her, the kind that didn't announce itself, but simply tracked the way a man tracks something he's learned to value. She looked back and gave him nothing because she wasn't ready yet, and he read that too, and didn't push. After supper, after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Winters had retired, Flora found Tucker in the office doing the end-of-week accounts. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "Sit down," she said. Something in her voice, some quality of weight, made him set his pen down immediately. He turned to face her fully, the way he turned to face things he was taking seriously. She sat in the chair across from the desk. She put her hands flat on her knees. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The office was completely quiet. Tucker Blackburn looked at her, and she watched something happen to his face that she had never seen happen to it before. The careful, disciplined composure that he wore like a second skin simply dissolved. Not into grief, not into fear. Into something raw and unguarded and entirely without calculation. The expression of a man who has just been handed something he had stopped letting himself want. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "Yes." He stood up from the desk. He crossed to where she was sitting. He crouched down in front of her chair so they were level eye to eye, and he took her hands off her knees and held them in his, the same way Mrs. Winters had that morning, but entirely different in the way it felt against her skin. "Flora," he said. "I'm frightened," she said, because she had promised herself honesty and she intended to keep it until the end. "I want you to know that. I'm frightened and She stopped. Her voice was threatening to do something she hadn't given it permission to do. I don't have a word for the other thing. The thing that's underneath the fear." "I do," Tucker said quietly. She looked at him. "Happy," he said. "That's the word." She felt it move through her when he said it. The recognition of the thing she'd been circling for weeks. The thing that had been building in the kitchen on Thursday mornings, and in the library at night, and in the space between them on the wagon seat, going north toward Salida. She felt it settle into place, the way the last piece of something settles the click of things finally fitting. "Yes," she said. "That's the word." He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly against his face, forehead against her knuckles, a gesture so private and unperformed that it was more intimate than anything else they had shared. And she felt the slight roughness of his jaw and the warmth of him, and something in her chest that had been held carefully for 10 weeks simply opened. She had not planned to say it yet. She had filed it away in that room in her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready for the air to touch. But it came out anyway, in the quiet of the office, with his forehead against her hands. "I love you," she said. "I didn't expect to. I want you to know it wasn't what I came here planning to do." She paused. "But it's true, and I've been honest with you about everything else, so." Tucker raised his head. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "And then, I love you too. I have for a while. I was waiting until you were ready to hear it." She laughed short, a little wet, entirely undignified, and he looked startled by the laugh for a moment. And then something in him released, and he laughed too quietly, and the two of them sat in the office in the December dark, with her hands in his, and the news of their child between them. And it was the most real thing Flora Blackburn had ever been inside of. But the news moved through the ranch the way news moves through a tight-knit community, quickly, with warmth, generating the kind of collective response that tells you more about the real culture of a place than any formal description could. Cal Briggs said, "Well, congratulations," and shook Tucker's hand with a grip that communicated considerably more than the words, and then turned to Flora and added, "You'll want to ride less in the later months. The sorrel mare's the smoothest if you're going to be in the saddle." Pete Duvall said nothing directly. He showed up the next morning with a crib he had apparently started building sometime in the night, unfinished, but already solid, and set it in the barn with a note that said, "For whenever." Flora found it mid-morning and stood looking at it for a moment with a feeling she couldn't entirely contain. Wick cried. He denied it immediately and attributed it to dust and cold air, and no one contradicted him because they were all fond of him, and he was 22 and had never learned that tears were not something to apologize for. Mrs. Winters began a project of reorganization that she described as simply making adjustments, which involved converting the small room at the top of the stairs, the one that had been used for storage, into something else entirely. She did not ask permission. She did not need to. Edmund Newsom arrived 4 days later, having received Flora's letter, and he stood in the front yard, looking like a man who had been carrying a debt for months and has just been told it was forgiven. He held his daughter for a long time without saying anything, And then he shook Tucker's hand and said, "Take care of her." And Tucker said, "She takes care of herself, but yes." And Edmund Newsom laughed for the first time in what Flora suspected was a very long time. The twist that winter was not a disaster. It was the opposite of a disaster, which in some ways required more adjustment. It came in January, in the form of a letter from Harrison Doyle in Denver, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning while Tucker was doing the accounts, and Flora was reviewing the spring planting schedule she'd drawn up with Mrs. Winters. Because the garden she'd decided was something she wanted to expand, and Mrs. Winters had responded to this ambition with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting years for someone to agree with her about the garden. Harrison's letter was 2 pages. Flora read it first because Tucker was mid-column and she was closer to the door. By the time Tucker looked up from his accounts, her expression had stopped him cold. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. Harrison had been investigating Hargrove's broader land acquisition pattern not as legal work, but because the Salida case had made him curious, and curiosity was apparently a chronic condition with Harrison Doyle. What he'd found was this Hargrove had attempted the same predatory loan structure with 4 other properties in the Copper Creek Valley over 3 years. 2 had succeeded the Kemper South parcel and the old Pratt homestead before anyone understood the pattern. 2 had been stopped the Newsom East parcel, and a 3rd property belonging to a family named Dillard, whose son had happened to be reading law at the time his father signed, and had caught the valuation clause before it could be triggered. Harrison had shared his findings with Judge Reeves, who had forwarded them to the Territorial Land Office in Denver. Hargrove was under investigation. The 2 properties he'd acquired through fraudulent loan structures were subject to review. The Kemper family had already been contacted. The Pratt homestead was more complicated. Silas Pratt had disappeared years ago, and the heirs were scattered, but the legal groundwork was being laid. Tucker set the letter down. "He's going to lose everything he acquired this way," Tucker said. "Possibly," Flora said. "Harrison says the investigation could take a year. But yes, possibly. If they restore the Kemper parcel." "Copper Creek gets its water access back," Flora said. "All of it. Every operation downstream." She paused. "Everything Hargrove was trying to control gets returned to the people it was taken from." Tucker looked at her. "You started this," he said. "When you found the boundary argument." "Harrison started it," Flora said for the second time. And for the second time, Tucker looked at her in a way that made clear he did not agree. "You found the boundary argument," he said. "Harrison wrote it up. There's a difference." She held his gaze. She thought about a woman standing in a church in her mother's dress saying "I do" in a voice she didn't recognize. And she thought about the same woman 6 months later, sitting at a kitchen table reviewing ledgers, with the ease of someone who belongs to a place so completely that she can no longer remember being a stranger in it. "All right," she said. "I found it." "Yes," Tucker said. "You did." The spring came, the way springs come to the Colorado high country slowly, then all at once, and with it came the particular energy of a ranch preparing for the season's full work. Calving branding fence repair. The south herds moved to the upper pasture that Flora had correctly called back in October. She was 5 months along by April, and she had made her peace with the physical reality of it with the same pragmatic directness she brought to everything. She rode less, she had taken Cal's advice about the sorrel mare, and she managed the house and the accounts and the ordering with the efficiency of someone who has found work that fits both her capability and her nature. Tucker hovered. He did it subtly the way he did most things, not with overt anxiety, not with the suffocating over-caution that she would have found intolerable, but with a heightened attentiveness, a positioning of himself in proximity to her. At moments he'd calculated as potentially difficult a habit of checking the ground for ice before she stepped onto the porch in the mornings that she pretended not to notice because she found it so unexpectedly tender. One morning in April, she caught him at it watching her from the barn door as she came across the yard, his expression stripped of its usual composure, and she stopped walking and looked at him directly. "Stop worrying," she said. "I'm not worrying," he said. "You're worrying. Your face does a thing." "My face doesn't do a thing." "Tucker, your face does a thing. I've been watching your face for 6 months." She crossed the remaining distance to the barn door. "I am strong and I am healthy. And Mrs. Winters has delivered 14 babies in this county, and she will be there, and everything is going to be fine." Tucker looked at her. "You don't know that," he said. And the rawness in those 4 words, the admission of fear from a man who almost never admitted it, hit her somewhere deep and certain. She put her hand against his jaw. It was the first time she had done that, reached for him with that particular quality of deliberate tenderness, and she felt him go very still under her hand. "No," she said. "I don't know it, but I believe it. And when I can't believe it, I'll tell you, and you can believe it for me until I get it back." She held his gaze. "That's what this is, Tucker. That's what we are. You carry what I can't carry, and I carry what you can't carry. And between the two of us, we cover everything." He took her hand from his jaw and held it. "When did you get this wise?" he asked. "I've always been this wise," Flora said. "You just weren't in a position to notice at first." He laughed fully, the way she'd learned he laughed when something genuinely caught him, and she laughed with him, standing in the April morning outside the barn door. And it was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself as significant, but that you carry for the rest of your life as a landmark. Harrison Thomas Blackburn arrived on the 14th of June, 1877, at 4:17 in the morning, in the upstairs bedroom of the Blackburn Ranch House, delivered by Mrs. Winters, with the efficiency of a woman who has done this before, and the tenderness of a woman who is doing it for someone she loves. He was healthy. He was loud. He had Tucker's gray eyes, which Flora discovered the first morning, and which made something in her chest crack open in the most complete way. Tucker held his son for the first time, standing beside the bed, and Flora watched him from the pillows, exhausted in every cell present, in every sense, and saw his face do the thing it had done in the office in December, when she'd told him that dissolution of composure, that unguarded rawness. But deeper now. Permanent seeming. "Harrison," Tucker said. "Just the name, just that. Just—" The baby curled his fingers around Tucker's thumb, with the instinctive grip of the newly born, and Tucker Blackburn, who had built 20,000 acres through will and discipline, and the refusal to flinch at anything, stood very still and looked at his son's hand, and did not try to hide what was happening to his face. Flora reached out and put her hand on Tucker's arm. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "We did this together," she said. "Yes," he said. "We did." Mrs. Winters tactfully found something to do in the other end of the room. Outside, the Colorado summer was fully arrived, the long light of the high country morning coming gold through the window, the sounds of the ranch coming to life below Boots on the porch, Cal's voice carrying across the yard, the particular morning music of a working place that never fully rests. Inside, Tucker sat on the edge of the bed with their son in his arms, and Flora leaned against his shoulder, and the three of them were quiet together for a moment that stretched beyond its own boundaries. Edmund Newsom arrived 2 days later, riding up from Copper Creek with a carved wooden box he'd made himself. She could tell by the familiar marks of his tools on the corners, and inside the box was her mother's brooch, the one Flora had thought was lost in the debt settlement. "I kept it back," he said quietly, standing in the doorway of the bedroom. "I told myself it was because it was your mother's. The truth was, I couldn't let go of everything." He set the box on the dresser. "It should have been yours from the beginning." Flora looked at the brooch and looked at her father. "Sit down, Papa," she said. "Hold your grandson." Edmund Newsom sat down and held Harrison Thomas Blackburn, with the careful hands of a man who has learned slowly and at great cost what is actually worth protecting. Tucker stood in the doorway watching, and Flora looked at him across the room, across the distance of everything that had happened between the church in Copper Creek and this bedroom in June. And she thought about fear and what it does to a person when it's the only thing you can see, and what happens when something else gradually grows large enough to take up more of the view. She had come to this house afraid of the man who owned it. She had spent 10 weeks learning that the man was not what the fear had made him. She had spent the months after that learning that she was not what the fear had made her, either not a woman without power, not a transaction completed, not a daughter given away in exchange for a number on a piece of paper. She was Flora Blackburn. She had saved her father's land with a boundary argument and a courage she'd had to locate in herself under pressure. She had built a partnership with a man who had the good sense to want a partner rather than a possession. She had turned a forced arrangement into something that felt every morning she woke up inside it like the truest version of her own life. She was 20 years old, and she had already survived the thing she'd feared most, and survived it not by enduring it, but by transforming it. And the transformation had required every quality she possessed: intelligence, stubbornness, honesty, and the particular willingness to be changed by evidence. Tucker crossed the room. He stood beside her chair and put his hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers, and Edmund Newsom looked up from his grandson's face and saw his daughter's expression and looked quickly away, because some things are private, even between fathers and daughters. The Blackburn Ranch grew through that summer and into the following year, the way things grow when the conditions are finally right, steadily with purpose without drama. The North Well proved stronger than the Denver engineer had estimated. The South herd reached 1,500 head by August, the number Tucker had been working toward. The garden that Flora expanded with Mrs. Winters became by the second summer something remarkable, practical, and beautiful in equal measure, the way Flora had always wanted things to be. Harrison Thomas Blackburn grew, the way healthy children grow fast, absorbing the world with the voracious attention of a person who has arrived in it without prejudice. He had Tucker's gray eyes and Flora's stubborn jaw and a laugh that started somewhere deep and came out like a small explosion of pure satisfaction, and both his parents were undone by it every single time. Cal Briggs taught him to walk by letting him hold on to 2 fingers and march across the kitchen floor. Wick carried him on his shoulders during the morning rounds, until Tucker decided the rounds had become considerably less efficient, but couldn't bring himself to say so. Pete Duvall carved him a horse from cedar, small, accurate in its proportions, the kind of thing that takes real skill, and set it on the nursery windowsill without comment. Edmund Newsom came every month. He came with straighter shoulders and clearer eyes, and he stopped drinking entirely sometime in February. And when Flora asked him why, he said, "Because I have a grandson now, and I intend for him to know who I am." She had no answer for that, except to be glad, and she was completely without reservation. There was an evening in October, a year and 4 months after the wedding, when Flora and Tucker sat on the porch after supper with the last light going gold over the range, and Harrison asleep inside, and Mrs. Winters's voice could be heard faintly through the kitchen window talking to someone, and the ranch was running at the quiet efficiency of an operation that knows what it's doing. Tucker said, "Do you remember what you asked me on the first night, what I actually wanted from this?" Flora looked at him. "You said you wanted the ranch to outlast you, and that you'd been alone long enough to notice." "Yes." He paused. "I got more than I wanted." Flora looked out at the range, at the land that was hers as much as hers by law, hers by work, hers by the deep claim of a woman who has invested everything she has in a place and found it worthy of the investment. "So did I," she said. She had come to this ranch afraid. She had come with nothing but her name and her mind and her mother's dress, and a determination not to be destroyed by circumstances she hadn't chosen. She had turned those things into this, into a son with gray eyes, a husband who told her the truth, a household that ran by her intelligence as much as his, a family restored by her refusal to accept the limits that other people's failures had tried to set around her. Tucker reached over and took her hand. She held on. The October dark came down over Copper Creek, Colorado, and the Blackburn Ranch held its ground against it, and the woman who had once pressed her mother's wedding ring into a stranger's palm and called this marriage a transaction sat on her own porch and knew with the full, unqualified certainty of a woman who has earned the right to know things that the life she was living was not the one she had been given. It was the one she had built, and it was hers.